two things, I guess, that I've had in my head ever since I thought about such an event. One is that it could not conceivably take place without an intervention about the art of the Orient, especially China, where the art of the sketch, if you will, the art of the brush and the brushwork was carried to a degree of artistry unlike any other part of the world. It's an entire culture, it seems to me, in which on some level the distinction between sketch and final work of art simply doesn't exist. The other thing I knew is that if you wanted anyone with the knowledge and the imagination to talk about such a subject, it was only Jim Cahill, who is, by all, is the doyen of this field in this country. I wouldn't even dream of reciting his enormous bibliography, except to say that it covers an extraordinary range of interest in Chinese painting. He has not only laid the foundations for that field in many respects, he has also revolutionized it in many others. I want to recite only one instance, which I hope he will forgive me for, my own experience with Jim. I once organized an equally insane event of a meeting, a session, a meeting about what would now be called outsider art. The subject was the problem was to deal with everything that wasn't normal art in an art historical context. And so I turned to Jim. It included, amongst other things, the art of primitive art, as it was called in those days, children's art, and outsider art in the proper sense, namely art of mentally imbalanced people, which is now a whole field unto itself. So I turned to Jim and I said, is there such a thing? Can you talk about such a thing in the Orient? And he said, and he came up with, believe it or not, an 18th century Chinese painter of monkeys, about whom one knows, whose biography no one knows quite a lot. And it was clear that this man was extremely neurotic, indeed psychotic. One knows this from the biography. Well, you should have heard Jim talk about the relationship between the glorious paintings of monkeys by this artist and his and what one knew of his biography. Jim, your turn.
Thank you very much, Irving, for that very good introduction to what I'm going to talk about and that very kind introduction to me. I'm very pleased to be here as one of the speakers on this occasion, honoring Hank Millen and Irving Lavin, not only because I've been associated with both of them for many years in many ways, but also because I have a comfortable feeling of being here in a somewhat familiar role. There was a period of some years in the 1970s, 80s, when I found myself serving on a number of important art history committees and boards, often with these two eminences as fellow members and as chairs very often. Committees on which I had the pleasure of representing what I used to call then the non-West, and I would be the non-West anyway. This was a time when the field was opening up more than before, realizing that it had to open up more than before to that great outer area, shall we call it, which traditional art history, European art history, hadn't really taken enough account of. And I and a few others were recruited, in effect, to represent it on these committees and so on. Also, as Irving says, in college art, in which it's the same one that Frank Gehry talked about the first day, and he took part in it too, maybe as a mad architect. I don't remember exactly what he was, but it was on mad artists, children artists, and primitive artists. And I was there, indeed, talking about a mad Chinese painter. In a sense, I'm teasing them. Both of them have been extremely supportive, and this is exactly what I'm getting around to saying, both of myself and of non-Western art studies, and I'm very grateful for that. It's been wonderful over the years working with Irving, for instance, with Hank on COSFA committees and so on, but also Irving on the National Committee for the History of Art, which he worked hard to make ecumenical. This has meant a lot to us, and it has had a really big effect on the field and on non-Western art studies. I say But here I am back in my simple function at an event honoring their retirement, and in keeping with my role of showing how the Chinese weren't like us, I will give a paper on why Irving's model, European model of the sketch as embodying or facilitating creativity doesn't really appear to apply to the practice of Chinese artists, and to suggest a few possible reasons why not. Let me have the first slides, please. And the house lights down, I guess. A single case that might fit that model, and even this is not entirely clear, is a group of sketches from the Buddhist cave site of Dunhuang, 8th, 9th century in date, drawn with brushes and ink on paper, a Chinese invention, as we heard about. And the first day, people were talking about the importance of the availability of paper from the 14th century on for making sketches. And here the Chinese are. They had invented it centuries earlier and are using it very effectively by the 8th, 9th century. These were, yes? Oh, excuse me. Oh, I thought somebody said, Jim, that was just a sneeze. Okay. That was a sketch. These sketches were sealed in a cave in the 11th century at Dunhuang, were acquired by the great French sinologue Paul Pelliot, and are now in the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris. The sketches were published first by a Chinese scholar named Rao Zhengyi, later with an extensive study by my former student, Sarah Fraser, who was here at the Institute recently, so many of you know her. Most of them appear to be preparatory sketches for wall paintings, or parts of wall paintings, or for portable paintings on silk. And indeed, many of them can be matched up closely with surviving works in both forms. This is obviously a wall painting, an extensive wall painting with figures and architecture and so on. And these are various figure groups and things that would be transferred onto the wall. Next slides, please. Some of them, however, are what Fraser terms practice sketches, identifiable as that by their being, oops, that side, oh, they're both sideways. What have I done? No. I hope not throughout. No, I don't think so. I loaded them this morning. Some, however, are what Fraser, can we turn them easily, or is that not, or can you turn your head sideways? I hope they won't all be like that. What Fraser terms practice sketches, identifiable as that by being loosely drawn, partial images and random arrangements, filling otherwise unused areas of the paper. Some of these reveal the artist trying alternative or different ways of doing parts of the picture, such as the head, face, hair, or the foot, which might replace this. And others, like those seen above the guardian figure here at the right, are simply sketches of unrelated motifs, and would appear to represent the anonymous workshop artist training their hands toward the goal of being able to draw freehand the full images in preparatory drawings for finished works. Next on the left. Now let's see, if this is sideways, then I'm in trouble. Oh, no, it's not. Okay, these must have been just a rare case. A comparable finished painting from Dunhuang, one of those now in the British Museum, impresses us, I think, as less powerful for reasons that have often been observed. That same preference for spontaneity over finish lay behind the reputation of the great, in fact, divine Wu Daozi, as he was called, the greatest of the Chinese figure masters, who painted grand figural compositions on the walls of temples and palaces in 8th century Chang'an, the capital. He reportedly instructed his assistants to color his works only lightly, or even leave them uncolored so as not to obscure the brush drawing. Next slides, please. From inscriptions, yeah, these are, oh, now we're sideways again. How can that be? I'm sure I put the dot, what? I don't know. I put the dots in the upper corner. The machine isn't strange, is it? No. I've done that for so many years I couldn't have somehow. Oh, well. But meanwhile, let me just continue and see what we can do. From descriptions of his paintings, we can imagine his figures in dynamic postures, turning in space, with some parts convincingly foreshortened. No work of his survives, even in reliable copies. And these are two more of the Dunhuang sketches. Yeah, I think it's probably better. I can't imagine, because I always, well, okay, there we are. And all this, he would paint, as I say, all this he accomplished without any underdrawing of any kind, working directly on the wall, making his images oh, that's the next, okay. Well, could we maybe try going back anyway, see if we can see. It's better to have, I think, the image there. Go back, please, on the right, even though it's sideways. Don't worry about it. Okay, never mind. And all this he accomplished without any underdrawing of any kind, working directly on the wall, making his images come into being swiftly, as if magically. A 9th century critic writes of him that heaven seems to have lent him his creative powers. So that's great. So I want to use Wu Daozi and the image of him working, as I say, directly on the walls of these great temples and palace buildings and so on, producing these pictures as if magically, with great virtuosity, as the background for what I'm going to say about a great deal of Chinese painting. Okay, change both sides, please. Oh, that's okay. Those are fine. Crowds would assemble to watch in awe as he drew freehand a perfect circle around the head of some divinity as a halo. The unmatched ability of Tang period artists to render volume in line drawing must have culminated in his work. And that's something that people comment on, too. Of course, we can assume that Wu Daozi and later artists as well, in their long pursuit of this transcendental skill, covered all the waste paper they could find with practice sketches like those from Dunhuang. But no other examples survive, nor is there any written record of the practice, so far as I know. Bodhisattva here holding something, turned, and a head of a nobleman. The next, please, both sides. What do survive, these are not easy to see, what do survive and what are mentioned in texts are preparatory drawings, Hua Gao in Chinese. Xiao Wenyan in his 1365 Tu Hui Baojian writes, quote, "The preparatory drawings of old artists are called sketches, funban." Funban's a complicated term, but for the moment, just sketches. Many connoisseurs have collected and treasured them. This is because, in their rough and unplanned look, they have a wonderful spontaneity, end quote. Surviving funban are not especially rough or unplanned, but rather highly finished preliminary drawings or cartoons for wall or scroll or screen paintings. These are two examples from a large group with an old attribution to Wu Daozi, and they appear to be actually 13th or 14th century in date. I can't see them very well. They're very fine. Came up an auction a couple years ago. New York didn't sell. Unreasonable expectations on the owner anyway, but quite fine. Next, please. We are sometimes unsure whether a linear design that could be such a cartoon for a temple wall painting is that, or alternatively, a careful copy made after the wall painting to preserve its composition and detail for use in subsequent restoration or replacement. This work, two sections of a hand scroll on silk, loosely attributed to the 11th century figure master Wu Cungyuan, generates far more energy in its dynamic procession of Taoist figures than the narrow confines of a hand scroll, only about 40 centimeters in height, can comfortably contain. It must have been either a cartoon or for a wall painting or a copy after one. And as I say, we can't really be sure which. Next, please, both sides. Artists who painted large, complex compositions normally began by making sketches directly on the silk or paper. In modern times, and presumably earlier, this was done with a charcoal stick, which left markings that either were covered by the painting or could be brushed off when the work was finished. That this was the common practice is attested by the singling out for special praise of artists who did not make them, but attacked the silk directly, with their entire composition, so the critics believed, clearly in their minds. One such was Cui Ba, whose hare and jays, two birds being chased away from, presumably their nest, although it's not shown by the hare is being chased away by the two birds, one of them in the air. A sign dated 1061. He was one artist who was known for not having used any kind of preliminary drawing on the silk and simply started with everything in his mind, so to speak. Change the one on the left, please. Just the left. And here is a detail. This is it's a terrible slide, I'm sorry, but it's another dated signed 11th century painting. The great landscapist Guo Xi, whose painting Early Spring is seen here, dated 1072 on the right. I say it a terrible slide. The detail is better. The detail comes from the middle right section right here, if you can see it. The Guo Xi would sometimes avoid the undesirable planned look by directing the plasterers preparing a palace wall to throw or daub on the plaster roughly, so that he could use the resulting chance configurations as the basis for his landscape composition. Early Chinese painting can boast a number of such predecessors to the Western artists of Jansen's Image Made by Chance well-known study. I'm going to show, let me go on a little bit. The medium of ink and colors on silk, unlike oils on canvas, didn't allow any overpainting and only very minor correction, so that we can't expect to find pentimenti or detect changes in plan through X-ray, as we can with European easel paintings. When we can detect them at all, it's through close observation and assumptions about the artist's intent. And now I'm going to show this section here, where the artist has made a quite remarkable change, I believe, something that is theoretically impossible in this kind of painting, which he chose to do anyway. The passage here is a temple, by the way, and a little viewing pavilion, and a stream going down in a dark ravine, and here rocky banks and trees. Okay, the next on the left only, please. Closer up detail of that section. In a remarkable and unnoticed passage in his early spring, which is, I say, right here, on the entire composition, Guaxi must have intended originally to turn a sketched-in area, here blacked out, to make this point, into one of his sloping banks of earth, like the one behind it, with bare trees growing out from it. In other words, we have to imagine this was originally intended as a sloping earth bank, and the trees grow out from it, and another one is beyond it, and another one is below it, and so on. Instead, next on the left, please. Instead, in a radical last-minute decision, realizing that to fill it in that way would work against the whole effect of erosion and undercutting and instability that is the theme of his picture, a vision of the world in process, he opens it up instead into a view into what appears to be a subterranean hollow, making the earth mass above overhang in a very implausible way, and adding more trees that turn around and grow this way, and earth banks here, and making these trees somehow turn around and grow. It's very strange. But such a passage, I think, reveals a great deal about the working methods and priorities of Chinese painting. In other words, he was willing to do this odd, awkward, difficult thing to fulfill, to realize a conception that mattered more to him than finish, even though he was a court painter. Next, please, both sides. I've been speaking up to now about professional artists, academy masters, technically trained studio painters. But as I'm sure many of you know, Chinese painting after the 13th century or so is dominated, at least in critical writings and collectors' preferences, which have largely determined what has been preserved, by scholar amateur artists, the so-called literati painters. Here are two examples, 14th century, Zhao Mengfu, here, early 14th probably, and 13th century, 12th maybe. Name doesn't matter. Working in principle from inner motivations, these scholar amateur artists, or literati painters, scorned preliminary sketches along with technical finish generally, since they aimed at capturing both momentary feeling and something of their personal cultivation and character in brushstrokes. The idea of working toward a better image by way of sketches would have been antithetical to their purpose. This point about Chinese painting, which I'll go on making, was raised interestingly in yesterday's musical session. Ed Cohn was pointing out the distinction between composers like Mozart, Beethoven, who seem to be working towards some finished, more or less fixed, not fixed really, but anyway, the ultimate whatever, versus a painter, a composer like Chopin, whose sketches and whose different versions of a certain passage don't seem to have, no one of them seems to be the ultimate, the ones that he had to choose. Chinese painters in that way are more like Chopin, open-ended. I'm not sure in other respects I'd like to have my Chinese painters likened more to Chopin than to Mozart, but that's another matter. For this particular point, let's say they're more like Chopin. At any rate, their painting was more open-ended. They didn't paint as if towards some predetermined end. The next on both sides, please. Oh, let's go back, please. I was going to make a point. The great 11th century painter Su Dong Po, who painted pictures not unlike this, great statesman, poet, whatever, calligrapher, everything, and painter. One of the forefathers, really, of literati painting. After, in a famous couplet, which he begins by saying, anyone who discusses painting in terms of likeness has the understanding of a child. Anti-mimetic, I'll talk about that later. Goes on to say, anyone who composes a poem insisting on this poem is not a real poet. I paraphrase, but something like that. It's not as though there is a kind of ideal outcome out there toward which they work. Next, please. This is a detail, rather dark, I'm sorry, of a painting of grapes by a 13th century artist named Guan. And here are pomegranates by Bada Shanran, who is the very mad artist that I presented in Irving's session. Both of them are Chan or Zen Buddhist monk artists, another category of amateur painters. By relying on inherited type images without being bound to them, and by repeating certain motifs and subjects in which their hands had become practiced, while giving room also to momentary impulse, they could produce accomplished and original pictures as if spontaneously on demand. Next two, please. Section of Zhao Mengfu's Villa by the Water, it's called Shuizhen Tu in Beijing, 1302, and a section of a famous hand scroll, Huang Gongwang's Dwelling in the Fuchun Mountains, painted, I'll speak in a bit, over a 3-year period, 1347 to 50. Landscape paintings by the Literati masters, even when elaborate in composition, what I'm trying to show is that this quality is not limited to their simple, sketchily done pictures, even when elaborate in composition, had to maintain a certain transparency, displaying the hand of the artist so as to suggest sustained spontaneity. Change the one on the right, please. Another section of the Huang Gongwang. This is Huang Gongwang's masterwork, the most admired, coveted, written about of literati landscapes. It's a long hand scroll, about maybe 6 times as long as what is now on the screen. According to Huang Gongwang's own inscription, he began by sketching out his entire composition, on a roll of paper that is, all in one day, and then added to it from time to time over a period of 3 years, carrying it around with him in his bag when he traveled, until it was somewhat arbitrarily judged to be finished and could be presented to the intended recipient, who had grown impatient. The quasi-improvisational look of the work, in which the hand of the artist remains clearly visible. There are places actually where he draws a rock over a place that's already painted in. We can see here a bunch of boulders going up the hillside, which he doesn't quite fill in. And throughout, it has something of this character. He, as I say, rather almost arbitrarily decides it's finished at one point, even though he could go on working at it a lot longer if he had wanted to. The quasi-improvisational look of the work, in which the hand of the artist remains clearly visible, reflects this manner of creation. Here we might find some agreement with Irving's model in that a kind of sketchiness is in effect equated with creativity. But it is sketchiness that is not a stage on the way, but survives into the finished work, as Irving was saying, as visual testimony to the spontaneity of its execution. Next two, please. Landscapes by the scholar amateur masters then, like their simpler pictures, were in principle made without preparatory sketches, even when radically experimental, like these two by the early 17th century landscapist Dong Qichang. They were required in theory to retain some roots or basis in older painting, expressed in stylistic references that were sometimes abstruse, making this a connoisseur's art. Xing Si, or lifelikeness, verisimilitude, had been placed scornfully by a 14th century theorist at the bottom of his list of criteria for judging quality in paintings. And this vigorous rejection of mimesis, fundamental to literati painting, continued to prevail among critics and to affect artists' practice. The first day, I think it was in Peter Parcel's paper, he was mentioning that Renaissance painters, in principle, didn't want to be thought of as pursuing mimesis. Well, yes, but a Chinese viewer would look at their pictures and say, yes, but why do you do it then? Because from their point of view, it's still very much a mimetic art. But that's, anyway, okay. The artist then had in principle no impetus for Gombrickian changes of the inherited schemata in the direction of truth to nature. Moreover, since the viewer was not located in relation to the scene by any kind of systematic perspective, adjustments to correct that aspect of the picture were not needed, and so forth. The hypothetical ideal form toward which you might work through successive sketches would have had no meaning for the Chinese painter. I should add once more, to avoid misunderstanding, that neither reliance on pre-existing type forms nor resonances with old styles diminish the originality and creativity of these paintings, at least the successful ones, any more than they do in the works by Picasso or Stravinsky or Ezra Pound. By no means do they move these Chinese pictures into Irving's medieval model, in which the past is simply replicated endlessly. Western authorities, as distinguished as Gombrich and Arthur Danto, have misunderstood this aspect of Chinese painting, and I've devoted some recent writings and lectures, including a lecture given here at Princeton, to attempting to correct these wrong readings of later Chinese paintings, but I won't even try to summarize that argument now, except to say that as early as the 14th century, I believe, Chinese painting entered into what Hans Belting and others call a post-historical phase. The painters, not only do the painters give up trying to make any kind of what we could see as reasonable steps that seem to follow one another, progress we might call it, whatever, but also the Chinese give up writing histories of painting, which they had been doing with great distinction and great interest from the 9th century on. From the 9th century up into the late 13th, say, there's a series of extraordinary histories of painting. And they recognize this artist can depend on that artist and so on. There's a certain logic there. After that, they don't even try. You cannot write a history of painting, as Belting points out somewhere, after there is no more, after painting is no longer taking that kind of pattern. Anyway, so it's just about when European writers, beginning with Vasari, I guess, are beginning to write art histories, and the Chinese have given it up. Well, the next on both sides, please. Literati painters did sometimes make sketches, but for other purposes. Huang Gongwang, the artist of the landscape hand scroll we just saw, in his essay on landscape painting, advises the painter to carry a brush with him on strolls in nature, to sketch interesting trees, and by implication other things, as he encounters them. Literati landscapists, such as Huang Gongwang's younger contemporary, Nizan, seen here in an album, leaf from an album on the right, and Dongqi Chang, on the left, made sketchbooks and scrolls of trees and rocks that may be instances of that practice, although the relationship of their imagery with that of nature is tenuous at best. Dongqi Chang, even though he was quite incapable of depicting a house convincingly, continues to try, as you see here, a very awkwardly drawn, strangely drawn house. But that was not his strength, as you well knew. Next on both sides, please. In doing such compilations of motifs, these artists are in some part following a much older type, the artist's repertory scroll, such as this one, which supplies models for any conceivable way one might want to portray a horse. The degree of taxonomic freedom seen here, I think, may call to mind for the Western viewer Foucault's famous citation of Borges in a certain Chinese encyclopedia, everything you could possibly want to know about the horse. Next, please. Professional artists of the kind with which we began did go on using preparatory drawings and sketches, and I will conclude with a brief account of the uses to which they were put. Some have been mentioned already. Studio artists would make sketch copies of compositions and motifs from old paintings to which they had access, to be used as needed in their own works. The very versatile 17th century master Gu Jianlong does this in a preserved album in the Nelson Gallery in Kansas City, one of a great many that he reportedly made. A contemporary writes that the albums could be piled higher than he was. So he made huge numbers of albums to preserve paintings he had access to, details from them. In this leaf, he's doing the pines and the rock from a Ming hand scroll, now in the Freer Gallery of Art. This equals that, and so on. Next on both sides. Portraitists would make preliminary drawings of their subjects, either to record their likenesses for later use or to show to their sitters to get their approval before doing the finished portrait. What I take to be an example of the former is an album of portraits of eminent men of Zhejiang province, dating from the mid-17th century, and exhibiting the new light and dark shading and other techniques adopted from European art that revitalized Chinese portraiture at this time and made Chinese viewers exclaim in wonderment that the painted images were exactly like reflections in a mirror. The pictures in this album are usually seen as finished portraits, and I myself published some of them as that, realizing only later that some features of them, the coarse paper on which they are painted, inscriptions that have the character of informal artist jottings, not finished inscriptions, show them to be preliminary drawings. As such, they present their subjects warts and all, as we would say, with uncompromising realism. The same people would doubtless have looked more bland and benign in their finished portraits. This is a very interesting aspect about sketching from nature and so on in both China and Japan, actually. That is to say that the movement is typically from the more lifelike, true to life, whatever, image to one that is less so, somewhat idealized, somewhat changed, whatever. But that's another big subject. On both sides, change please. In 1781, the Yangzhou master Luo Ping made this preliminary sketch for a portrait of the famous literateur Yuan Mei and gave it to him for approval, which in this case was withheld. Before returning it to the artist, Yuan Mei wrote a long, facetiously philosophical inscription at the top, playing with the question of whether he himself or the artist's image was the real Yuan Mei, and adding that while he himself was satisfied with the portrait, the people in his household complained that it made him look like the man who delivered vegetables to the back door. Again, the final image would probably have been less harsh, but it was never made. I published this preliminary sketch for the first time in 1959. Richard Vinograd discussed it much more seriously and excellently in his 1992 book on Chinese portraiture, but neither of us put it in what I now believe to be the right context. Next, please, both sides. Yes? Okay. Painters doing major pictures for important clients, and most of all court artists working for the emperor, were required to prepare and submit detailed cartoons before they could carry out the finished work. When the Italian Jesuit artist Giuseppe Castiglione, Chinese name Long Shining, who served under 3 Chinese emperors, was preparing to paint his famous 100 Horses scroll in 1728, he made a cartoon of the whole large-scale composition, which is now in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. These are 2 details. I assume it's a real cartoon. It's not a painting after the finished painting. It appears to be the real thing. Here are some of the horses, and here a couple of Tartar people lighting a pipe. And next on the left, please. Next on the left, please. And this is the corresponding detail with this figure group. The cursive drawing of some of the background in the cartoon, contrasting with the precise linear drawing of the figures, may reflect Castiglione's practice of sometimes leaving the background to be filled in by Chinese assistants in his studio. Next, please. Similarly, before a team of 5 painters, including Chun Mei, executed the well-known Qing period version of the Qingming Festival scroll in 1735, a highly detailed and highly finished preliminary drawing was made, and signed, somewhat surprisingly, by an entirely different artist, whose name does not appear on the finished scroll. The circumstances behind this odd division of labor remain to be clarified. I can't tell you why. What? I'm about finishing. What? Next, please. I'm on my last slides. Even under a system with such built-in precautions, a finished painting might displease the client and have to be redone. We know from literary references about paintings that were returned to the artist by dissatisfied customers. And I will conclude with a case of a court painting done for the 18th century Qianlong emperor, who kept an especially tight control over his academy artists. It is a New Year's picture portraying the emperor and some of his consorts and sons on the porch of a palace building, and it survives in 2 versions. One at right is dated 1738, and signed by 5 court artists, including the same Castiglione and Chun Mei. The other on the left, the other on the left, is unsigned, but has been preserved in the palace in Beijing. Those who have written about the 2 versions have not speculated on their relationship. I would guess that the unsigned picture at the left here was the first version that was rejected by the emperor, and look for reasons why. One is surely that the unsigned work situates the emperor off-center and within a strong perspectival pull into depth that works to draw the viewer's attention away from him. The other reason is that he is portrayed in a manner too anecdotal, too relaxed, bending his head to look down at the child in his lap. The last slide here on the right, please. Detail from it. The same is true of the other participants in the scene, such as these. Oops, did I have it on the wrong side? Okay, never mind, skip it. Keep the 2 on. Such as the boys who watch the firecracker being set off in this picture. I have a detail, doesn't matter. For us, these may be just the pictures that make this picture more appealing, and the other rather stiffer and colder. Emperor right in the center, sitting up stiff, and so on. We can surmise the artists themselves may also have preferred the earlier version, but in China, and especially in the imperial court, their preferences didn't count for much. I'm quite aware that some or even most of the Chinese practices I've outlined here have approximate equivalents in European painting, but limits of time and my competence have ruled out serious analytical comparisons. I'm inclined nonetheless to recognize important differences, and especially for our present concern, to believe that the Chinese use of sketches stands apart from the somewhat dichotomized developmental pattern of the symposium statement, in which the medieval practice tending to inhibit creativity gives way to the Renaissance and later practice that encourages it. This formulation is based, I think, in deep Western beliefs about the ideal forms or images toward which the artist might strive, images aesthetically or naturalistically or expressively better than those from which they depart, and also about how the best art arises from conditions in which the artist is least subject to outside demands. Neither quite corresponds with Chinese reasons for preferring one image or work over another. Painting in China, for which the artist claimed an inner motivation of self-expression, chiefly literati painting, emphasized spontaneity in such a way as to make sketches counterproductive. While painting done by their professional masters, responding in principle to outer motivations, located decisions about altering or improving the image more in the client than in the artist. The question of how far these non-correspondences betray real observable differences between the European and Chinese artistic traditions, and how far they only reflect differences in the ways the concepts and practices within those traditions are formulated, is the larger and more difficult question that I will in the end leave unsatisfyingly open. Thank you. All right.